instrument or a sharp pin over these rubber items.
छंद के बंधन से मुक्ति चाहिए, क्योंकि मुक्ति जैसा मैंने कहा, मुक्ति उनकी स्वाधीनता उनकी जो है एक मूल इच्छा है।
Hello friends, welcome back to the course on spectroscopic methods of analysis. Today we will start with
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome you all to this Gandarshan session. Today, our topic of discussion is ecological adaptation of plants. Now, this particular unit, it belongs to your course Plant Ecology and Taxonomy, which is included under BSc General course in Botany. Now, in this particular unit, we will be discussing about the different adaptive features which are acquired primarily by two groups of plants, that is hydrophytes and xerophytes. So, before we begin, we have to clarify few terminologies like what is meant by adaptation, second, what are hydrophytes and what are xerophytes. Once these are clear, then we will go into the different ecological modifications. By ecological modifications, we mean the physiological modifications, the morphological modifications, and the anatomical modifications, which are acquired or which are developed by these plants in order to sustain better in their ecological habitats. So, first of all, what is meant by adaptation? Or what are the adaptive features? That is, the plants, we all know that they are static. They cannot move, unlike animals or human beings. We can move, but plants cannot move. Therefore, they are static. They are standing in one position and they are doing all the work. They are performing all the physiological functions. And this property makes them acquire certain features depending on their habitat. For example, a plant which is terrestrial in nature will not show the same feature as a plant which is aquatic, which is present in water. Even in terrestrial system, a plant which is present in normal soil and a plant which is present in a desert where there is shortage of water, or a plant which is present in saline soil, that is salty water. So all these plants, they will have different anatomical features, they will have different physiological features, they have different morphological features. So adaptation basically means certain changes in some features like morphology, anatomy and physiology, which makes the plants sustain better or survive better in their ecological habitats. So plants growing in different habitats, they show different features. They develop certain characteristics which help them to survive in that habitat. So these characteristics are called adaptation or adaptive features. As I said, these are structural, morphological and physiological. Next we come to what do you mean by the hydrophytes. So first of all, we will actually discuss the two main groups of plants, that is hydrophytes and xerophytes, and we begin our discussion with the hydrophytes. Hydro means water. So the hydrophytes are plants which live in water. That is, they have adaptive features which help them to survive in aquatic environment. What are aquatic environment? It can be pond, it can be rivers, streams, even it can be lakes, wetlands, sometimes even sea, oceans. These are also aquatic habitat. Now, if you think of the hydrophytes, that means the definition is clear that the hydrophytes are plants which survive in water. But even in water, there are certain classifications. That is, hydrophytes differ in their features even when they are present in water habitat. That means there will be different groups of hydrophytes, like certain hydrophytes which are totally immersed, certain hydrophytes are there which are actually floating, certain hydrophytes are there which are half submerged and half aerial, certain parts remain above water surface, certain parts remain below the water surface. So depending on that, again, whether they are fully submerged, whether they are partly submerged, or whether they are aerial, that is present above the water surface, depending upon that, again, there are differences in the adaptive features. So these are some of the things which we are going to discuss today. How do you classify the hydrophytes? Number one. And number two is how each of these classes of hydrophytes develop certain features which enable them to remain or survive in the aquatic environment. So hydrophytes either float on the surface of water or remain fully submerged or half submerged in water. Some aquatic plants grow in soil which is permanently saturated with water. See, they are actually present in soil, but the soil is totally maybe saturated with water. So basically, these type of plants also face some sort of water saturation or water logging. Although they are present in land, but there is enough of water. So all these are known as emergent species. Such types of plants are known as emergent species. So we will take a look into each of these different groups of or classes of hydrophytes. Now, on the basis of attachment of the plants, hydrophytes have been classified into different types. Number one is haptophytes. Haptophytes means which are attached to the substrate, like algae, lichens, lower groups of plants like algae, lichens, bryophytes, and also some angiosperms, some flowering plants. Rhizophytes, that is the plants in which the basal parts penetrate the soil or the substrate in which they grow. Only the basal part, like root system. Root system is present beneath the soil. So those are known as the rhizophytes. Planophytes, that is freely floating plants with submerged or surface floating photosynthetic organs, like phytoplanktons or planktophytes or pleustophytes. Now rhizophytes, rhizo means something related to root. So they possess a short stem and a rosette of stiff leaves with or without stolons. Some rhizophytes possess a long stem, submerged leaves, and aerial or submerged reproductive organs which are referred to as elodioids. So these are the characteristic features of the rhizophytes. So these are the classification based on the type of the soil in which the plants reside. Now, as I said, that we will discuss the adaptive features of each of the groups of hydrophytes. So we start with the free floating plants. Free floating plant means you must have seen many plants where the leaf surface is floating on the surface of water. Like if you have seen the lotus plant, lotus leaves you have seen. So these plants, they normally float on the surface of water. Free floating plants. That is, the roots, they are not attached to the soil surface, but they float on the surface of water. In fact, the roots are actually absent, or the roots are very poorly developed, fragile roots. And they have a rosette of aerial floating leaves. Floating leaves. That's why I gave you the example of lotus. The anatomy of leaf and stem shows the presence of reduced assimilatory tissues. So the main feature is that these type of plants, they are freely floating, and in most of the cases they have floating leaves. So they are called the free floating hydrophytes. The reproductive organs are also aerial and floating. Like some of the examples are given: Salvinia, Eichhornia crassipes. Eichhornia is, the common name is water hyacinth, which is very common in the ponds, okay, even sometimes in the rivers. This is an exotic plant, okay, and usually in the rainy season you will find in the this type of water hyacinth, lot of water hyacinth in the ponds accumulation. Pistia, Trappa, Lemna, Wolffia. So Lemna, in fact, it has very, very rudimentary root, one strand of root. Wolffia, this is a very characteristic plant. It is rootless. It does not have any root. And Wolffia is also known as the smallest angiospermic plant. And the plant has no root. Now imagine the plant is without any root. Why? Because they don't need the roots, because they are present in an aquatic environment. That is, all around they are surrounded by water. That is why they do not need the roots to absorb water from the soil, because they are actually present in water, and therefore it enters directly. They don't need to absorb water via the roots. That is why they don't need roots, and therefore they don't have roots also. Nymphia, they also possess the floating leaves attached on long flexible petioles, that is the leaf stalk. Nymphoids, they show the stoloniferous trailing stems with floating leaves on short petioles. So the main thing is that all these type of plants, they have very poor root system, and they are free floating, either the entire plant or the leaf surface. So we call them as the floating hydrophytes, free floating hydrophytes. Next group is floating submerged plants. What is the difference? Difference is that these plants are also floating, but they are submerged. That means they are attached. In the earlier case, it was not attached. There was no attachment directly, but here they are also submerged. That means leaves are submerged in water. Foliage or leaves of these plants are submerged in water. The plants are heterophyllous, that is, submerged leaves are present along with floating leaves. This is very interesting. They have two different forms of leaves. One type of leaf which is floating leaf, and the next category there are some leaves which are submerged leaves. Now these two type of leaves will look different. Why? Because the leaves which are floating, they do not have to face direct water current. So in most of the cases they are entire leaves. But the leaves which are facing the water current, which are submerged, they actually, because of the water current, they are dissected. And therefore, this phenomenon is known as heterophyly. Heterophyly means where you have two different forms of leaves. The leaves which are floating, those are entire, whereas the leaves which are submerged, because of the water current, they appear to be dissected. That is divided into different smaller parts. Leaves are filiform, that is ribbon shaped or finely divided. These plants are found at a depth of about 12 meters. The reproductive organs are either aerial floating or submerged. So each of these organs, or each of the the basic plant organs, they are present in two forms, because they have both the properties, that is floating and submerged. Now we can again divide this type of plants into groups like coalescent, that is the plants do not possess rhizome. The roots arise from the nodes of the leafy stems, like Hydrilla, Najas. Stoloniferous, that is leaves are rosette type arising from a condensed tuberous stalk called rhizome, like Isoetes, Sagittaria, Vallisneria. These are all very important group of hydrophytes. Thalloid, that is the plant body is reduced to a cylindrical or flattened, creeping or floating polymorphic thallus, having erect or trailing secondary branches, like Podostemon. And then there are submerged species which rise to the surface to flower and sink to the bottom of the substratum to perinate. That means for the flowering, for reproduction, they actually rise to the surface, but the perinating structures, these are present below. These are present at the bottom of the water surface, like Lemna utricularia. Now we come to the third category of hydrophytes, that is rooted submerged. So here, unlike the earlier two classification, here the plants are completely submerged. We do not find any floating parts or floating organs. The entire plant is present below the water surface, and they are anchored, they are attached to the substratum. These plants possess long internodes, no palisade parenchyma, presence of chloroplasts in the epidermal cells, like Vallisneria, Hydrilla, Najas, etc. In Vallisneria, unisexual staminate flowers break off from the inflorescence and float on the surface of the water, and then the scape of the pistillate flower elongates and reaches the surface of water, where it gets pollinated by the pollens of the staminate flower. So they have two different types of flower, the staminate flower and the pistillate flower. So what is the unique or the peculiarity of the reproductive feature or the peculiarity of the pollination? Pollination mechanism here is the staminate flowers, they break off and then they float on the water surface, so that the anthers are visible, anthers are accessible, and the pistillate flower, the scape of the pistillate flower, it elongates and it reaches the water surface, and then there is a pollination because the pollens are available on the water surface. Then after fertilization, the scape shortens and the young plant completes its development underwater. So the development, further development after pollination is below the water surface. So see the wonderful way of pollination, that is the pistillate flower rise, then they get the access of the pollen grains, the pollination is done, and then fertilization is complete, the scape again shortens and further development again occurs below the water surface. So this is the case in case of with the Vallisneria. Vallisneria, they are the pollination mechanism. Next we come to the emergent species. That is, the plants grow in shallow water with their underground parts in water or water saturated soil. I already told you what is meant by emergent species. Emergent species means that is the plants, these type of plants, they are present in soil which is saturated with water. And the shoots, they grow well above the water surface. So you can imagine these plants to be growing in the marshy areas, and therefore they are also known as marsh plants or helophytes, because marshy areas actually contain the water which is saturated, soil which is saturated with water. They have rhizome or corm, that is the perennials, that is we are talking of the stem, the type of the stem, that is rhizome or corm. Some of the species are heterophylous. The submerged and the floating leaves precede the mature aerial leaves. They produce aerial reproductive organs. So the reproductive organs, these are totally aerial. That means they are present. They have no connection with the water. They are totally present above the water surface. Typha, Phragmites, Scarpus, Sagittaria. So these kind of plants. So they are called emergent species. Leaf surface is reduced. In marshy hydrophytes, special roots grow erect and project above the poorly aerated muddy soil. These structures are called pneumatophores. In fact, you must have heard about pneumatophores in the mangrove plants. That is the plants which grow in the saline soil. In this type of soil also you will find the pneumatophores. That is the roots, they project above the soil surface. And then they absorb certain nutrients, and they absorb certain ions or whatever needed urgently by the plant. So pneumatophores like Rhizophora, Avicennia, these are all example of halophytes. So even in halophytes you will find or marsh plants you will find this kind of pneumatophores. Some varieties of rice grow with its roots partly submerged in water. You know that rice is a water loving plant. You know it needs a lot of irrigation, rice. In the agricultural field, rice agricultural field, if you have gone, you must have seen that there is always water logging because it needs irrigation water. So in a way, though we don't call it a hydrophyte, but in a way it is also it also resides in a habitat which has lot of water. And because of the huge presence of water, there is an oxygen deficiency, or we call it anoxygenic. That is, there is no oxygen poor conditions. And therefore, because there is oxygen shortage in such areas or in such fields, sometimes these type of plants, they have developed certain air channels in their roots. We will not call them air cavities, but we call them air channels. And what is the purpose of developing these air channels? So that there is better, they can circulate the oxygen, they can diffuse the oxygen in a better way, because there is shortage of oxygen, deficiency of oxygen in such soil. So these are some of the properties of the emergent plants or the emergent species. Roots normally they grow normally in low oxygen conditions. Certain hydrophytes grow in still water or wet soil. Their roots possess the ability to respire anaerobically, because as I told you, if there is oxygen shortage, then they should develop some mechanism for respiration. So sometimes they might develop anaerobic respiration. Okay. Though we know that normally it's an aerobic mode of respiration, but certain parts of the plants or certain groups of plants may develop anaerobic respiration. Heterophyly, I already told you that heterophyly, that is the leaves are of two types. I already mentioned that is leaves which are present below the water surface, they have a different kind of leaf morphology, whereas the leaves which are present above the water surface, they have some different morphology. Reproduction. In submerged species, the flowers are raised in the air above. Most of the hydrophytes flower much less. Now, you don't find sexual reproduction in hydrophytes very much. Mostly it's by vegetative means, vegetative reproduction. And the vegetative reproduction occurs by fragmentation. Fragmentation means fragmentation followed by regeneration. That means any small part may break off from the parent plant, which is having a vegetative bud. And then using that fragment, it regenerates. It develops into a new plant. So that is the common way of reproduction in the hydrophytes. That is vegetative propagation. Even they may harbor certain vegetative propagules. normally you have very little development of the flowers, sexual flowers, because as I said, mode of reproduction is vegetative. Sometimes small tubers are formed on the ends of the stolons or lateral branches, while there are certain species where the inflorescence develops dwarf shoots known as turions at the apex. So these structures, they actually help the plant to propagate, vegetative propagation. Gamiparous buds, they develop from the foliar tissues, and this also has been reported in certain hydrophytes. So the take-home lesson is that the sexual reproduction is almost rare. The chief method of reproduction is the vegetative reproduction. Now we will now list the major categories of hydrophytes are clear to you now. So now we will just list the different adaptive features which are present in the hydrophytes. In fact, we have discussed many of them. Now we will just mention them point-wise. Number 1, in free-floating plants, leaves are flat and contain air spaces that give the plant buoyancy, or that enable the plant to maintain buoyancy, allowing the leaves to float on the surface of water. The leaves absorb sunlight to carry out photosynthesis. Leaves possess a thin layer of epidermis, as they do not need to conserve water to maintain water balance within the plant. So, as I said that the leaves float on the water surface. How is this possible? That means there should be some property by which the plant can maintain buoyancy. So this is actually facilitated by the formation of air spaces. The air spaces are air gaps, and usually we call them parenchyma, that is parenchymatous tissues with cavities, with air cavities. So even in the roots, in the leaves, these type of air cavities or parenchymatous tissue develop, which enables them to float on the water surface. Very important property, which you normally don't find in the mesophytes, that is the plants growing in the terrestrial system. Roots are poorly formed or absent. Why? Because they don't need roots. As I said, what is the main function of root? Number 1, to attach to the substratum, and number 2, to absorb the minerals, to absorb the water and the mineral ions from the soil. But they are present in water only. Therefore, they don't need to transport water from the soil. Therefore, they don't need the well-developed roots, and that is why roots are very poorly developed in the aquatic plants. Roots, if present, are thin, poorly developed and short. But this is not the case in the plants which are residing in the soil. There the roots are, they have either the tap roots, well-developed tap roots, which probe deep into the soil. Sometimes in floating species with roset leaves, roots adventitious are shorter and less branched. So again, of course there are variations, and the roots also develop chloroplasts in their epidermal and cortical cells, which can trap light and contribute in photosynthetic activity. Root hairs are absent. In fact, if the root is not developed, then obviously the root hairs will also be non-root hairs, root caps. These are also very poorly developed. So underdeveloped roots, underdeveloped root hairs, or even root caps. Stem is long, slender and flexible in submerged plants. Example, Hydrilla. Stem is slender or thick, short and spongy, like in Eichhornia, that is in water hyacinth. There you have a spongy stem. Stem is a well-developed rhizome in rooted plants with free-floating leaves, like Nymphia, Nelambo, etc. Then we come to the stem. Stem, compared to the root, stem is well developed. It's a tough and woody rhizome, at least in some species like cypress, typha, etc. Particularly in the emergent species, the stem is quite developed. Whereas in case of those plants which are free floating or which are submerged, there the stem is not that developed. But in any case, the stem is better developed as compared to the roots. And another feature, that is, there is no lignified tissue. The stem does not have any lignified tissue. Why? Because they don't need it. They live in water surface. They live in the they reside in the water, so they don't need any mechanical tissues like lignin. That is, which is needed for strengthening them. The hollow stem helps the plant maintain buoyancy and provides space for storage of gases such as carbon dioxide and oxygen. Next point, which is also very important, is that the conducting tissues. What do you mean by conducting tissues? That is the xylem and the phloem. Vascular bundles or the vascular cylinder. What are the functions of xylem and phloem? You must have read that. That is, xylem, it helps in the conduction of water. You have read about ascent of sap. That is conduction of water. What is the function of the phloem? That is, they help in the translocation of the solutes. You have read about the sieve tubes, the companion cells. But these plants do not require that. They don't need to transport water. They do not need to transport the solutes or the minerals because they are present in water. And it is simply by gaseous diffusion that the different materials are being transported into the plant system. So they don't need elaborate conducting tissues. That is why they have underdeveloped xylem tissue and also phloem tissue, because there is no requirement of water transport within the tissue. And the gases, they diffuse by osmosis, and that is why they, again I repeat, that they have the aerenchyma, that is, they have the air space, which facilitates gaseous diffusion or gaseous exchange. Gaseous exchange is also important for meeting the oxygen requirement during respiration. The gases diffuse through the stem and are important for sustaining carbon dioxide within the plant, because they have to carry out photosynthesis. That is important. And for that they need this kind of gaseous exchange or gaseous diffusion. Leaves, we have already, I think I have already mentioned that there are different forms of leaves. If it is a submerged plant, what type of leaf you will have. If it is floating, what type of leaf you will have. Again, if it is partly submerged, what type of leaf you will have. So in short, leaves are of different forms, leaves are of different shapes, and that is why we come across this term, that is heterophyly. Leaf petiole or the leaf base, it also forms a bladder-like swelling, because they, particularly for those which have the floating leaves, they have a long petiole and they have a bladder-like swelling and consisting of the spongy parenchyma. So these flat surfaces help in the floating of the plant and mainly consists of spongy parenchyma. Eichhornia, like water hyacinth, the whole petiole may be swollen into a bulbous spongy float. In submerged species, the petioles or the leaf bases remain slender and elongated. Sometimes they may have some mechanical tissues. That is, the dissected leaves, they may have some mechanical tissue, but not lignin or not sclerenchyma. They may develop some cholenchymatous tissue. Angular cholenchymatous tissue found along the margins of finely divided or ribbon-shaped leaves of some species such as Eichhornia, which helps them to resist the stress, because water current is there and they have to resist that water current. So that is also imposing some kind of stress on the plant. And to withstand that, they need some sort of mechanical tissue, though not as strong as lignin or sclerenchyma, but at least the collenchyma, which is thicker than the parenchymatous tissue. So sometimes in some areas they may develop collenchymatous tissue that is sufficient enough for them to withstand the stress due to water current. Leaf and stem cells of hydrophytes possess intercellular air space called lacunar erenchyma. I don't think I need to repeat again. Vascular system is not well developed, whether in leaf, whether in root, wherever you go, even in the stem, the vascular cylinders are poorly developed. Cuticle. You know what is meant by cuticle? That is a covering outside the stem, outside the epidermis. So here you don't have the cuticularized epidermis. Even you don't have the stomata. Stomata are mostly absent, or even if they are present, they are non-functional. Stomata are found mostly on the leaf in the submerged species, and the stomata is never closed. Stomata is always open because they don't need to conserve water. Why does a stomata close? We know that in order to reduce transpiration, water loss, like the plants which are present in water shortage area, like after some time we will read about the xerophytes. They live in the desert, so they need to preserve water or conserve water so that there is no water loss, and therefore the stomata remain closed. But here there is no such chance of water shortage because they are present in water. That is why the stomata always remain open, they never get closed. Vascular tissue is reduced and the stele consists of a few vascular elements or bundles. Secondary growth is absent because they don't need thickening, they don't need to strengthen themselves. Closely packed hairs present at the hydrophobic tips and heterophyly. So these are in short, or I won't say in short, I mean I have talked in a quite elaborate basis that depending on the different hydrophytes, what are the different features. We next move to, so this is actually the picture you can see, I have represented here some of the pictures like Eichhornia and Pistia, Typha and Phragmites. These are all given in your SLMs. You can find the figures there also. And Hydrilla, a rooted submerged plant, and Sagittaria. So it's just to show how these plants look like. These are actually the diagrammatic figures. Now, before we close this discussion with the hydrophytes, there are two more different kinds of hydrophytes like plankton and pleuston. Plankton means any dead or living organism that float passively in water, and they are carried by water current or wind action. Sometimes they are also called microphytes. These are very minute plants, and like Spirogyra, it's a green algae, Zygnema. These are all examples of planktons. So these are also basically hydrophytes. Cyanophyceae like blue-green algae like Anabina, Oscillatoria, diatoms, dinoflagellates, chlorophycean members. So these are all different examples. Adaptation, if you just discuss the adaptation, then they have the floating devices and they have the pseudovacuoles. The pseudovacuoles, particularly in the blue-green algae, you will find these pseudovacuoles which helps the organisms to maintain their buoyancy. Watery gelatinous envelope surrounding the cell, little silicification of the valve and connecting band portion of the wall prevents them from becoming too heavy. So these are actually, because they are freely floating, with very light particles, they float along with the water current. So not much of heavy weight, okay, so that they can drift very easily. Again, you have the classification like haploplankton, limnoplankton, saproplankton. What are pleustons? Pleustons means sometimes on the banks of stretches of fresh water, you can see certain megaphytes. These are not microphytes, these are megaphytes. These are comparatively larger organisms. They are not fixed, but they are free swimming or free floating like plankton. But then what is the difference between plankton and pleuston? Pleuston is distinguished from plankton by occurrence of different growth forms. They can be mosses, they can be ferns, they can be even certain spermatophyte algae. Okay, so they actually constitute a false plankton, like bryophyta, certain species of Rixia, certain pteridophytes, Azolla salvinia, certain spermatophyte like Lemna wolffia, about whom we have just talked a little while ago, Pistia, Eichhornia. So these are actually pleuston. So pleustons are comparatively larger organisms as compared to planktons, megaphytes. That's why we are calling them as the megaphytes. So with this we end our discussion on hydrophytes. Now we go to the next topic, that is the xerophytes. That is the plants which live in deserts where there is water shortage, dry habitat. So you have to understand that here the adaptive feature will be totally different. It is a totally different environment. There is no water. There is shortage of water or there is no water at all. Then how will the plant survive? Still there are plants which survive in such hostile environment. How do they survive? So we have to understand those features. Obviously, they will develop certain means by which they can minimize the water loss or try to survive them in water shortage area. They are defined as plants that grow on substrate that possess gravitational groundwater at a depth of 20 to 25 centimeter. They are not finding water in the surface. They have to go deeper and deeper to find the water, in search of water. Also, they have to protect themselves from water loss. So what will they develop? Waxy leaf coatings, ability to drop leaves during dry periods, ability to fold leaves to reduce sunlight absorption, and development of a dense, hairy leaf covering. So these are very gross adaptive features. Of course, we will be discussing in more details. Now, what are the morphological characteristics of xerophytes? Root system is very well developed because the roots have to go deep and deep into the soil. They can penetrate deeper into, they have to penetrate deeper into the soil for search of water. Root hairs are present, root caps are developed. They have to check transpiration. That is why the leaves are reduced. The surface area of the leaf needs to be reduced. Sometimes the leaves are modified into some other structures. Even the stem may be modified into some other structures. Leaves may be modified into phyllodes like in acacia, or they may become succulent. Succulent means they become fleshy like aloe, agave, these kind of plants. The leaves develop very light green coloration. Why? Because if they are develop deep green coloration, then they will absorb greater amount of sunlight and there will be much more heating effect. That is why they develop. If you must have seen that during summer we wear light clothes. Why? So that the absorption is less. Solar absorption is less. So the plants do the same thing. That is, they develop very light color, light green coloration, so that they do not absorb much sunlight. And therefore there is a cooling effect. Stems are stunted, hard, rigid. If you compare the proportion of the root and stem, then you will see the root is longer. The stem is stunted or retarded in growth. Shorter plants. And the stem may be modified into certain leaf-like structures which are called phylloclads, like you find in Opuntia, or cladodes like you find in asparagus. Stems may show coating of hairs or waxes, or the stems may be reduced to spines. in plants where the leaves are absent, the stem performs the function of photosynthesis, because leaves are reduced to some surface area of the leaf is reduced. So how is this compensated? Either the number of the leaves will increase because the surface area of the leaf is reduced, so the number of leaves need to be increased, or the stem should take the function of the leaf. And the stem should modify itself into a green leaf-like structure which can take up the function of the leaf, because it also has to minimize transpiration. And the transpiration, you know that the stomata, it is mainly responsible for transpiration. So there should be stomatal closure. During the daytime, when there is huge amount of sunlight coming, the stomata needs to be closed. And then again at night, the stomata can open. So these are modifications which the plant needs to perform. Now, xerophytes, like hydrophytes, you can classify the xerophytes also. Number 1, drought avoiding or succulent. Succulent means these type of xerophytes, they have very small size, restricted or stunted growth, and they can avoid scanty water supply. How? Because they have developed succulent stems and leaves. That means the stems and the leaves, they become fleshy and they try to store the water. Like you must have seen the hump of a camel. You know that it also stores water. So it's a similar kind of thing, that they become spongy and they try to store water. Especially when there is a very huge episode of dryness, then they can survive. So this is a diagram, or it's a diagrammatic view of the Opuntia and aloe. Both of them are the succulent plant species. This is given in your SLM also. Second category, that is drought escaping. Now whenever there is a danger, there are two ways of survival. Even when we face danger, what we do? There are some people who will deal with the danger, who will try to fight. And there are some people who will escape from the site of danger. So plants also do the same thing. There are some xerophytes who actually escape from this dryness. How do they escape? That is, whenever there is rain available, very short seasonal rain, they complete their life cycle within that and then they die. Again, during the next season, when the rain reappears, these type of plants grow. They complete their life cycle within that short period and then die. That means they never face the situation. They never face the stress situation or the dryness. So these type of plants are called drought escaping plants, or mostly these are ephemeral annuals. They are called ephemerals. They have a very short growing and flowering season consisting of a few weeks only, like Argimon mexicana, Cassia tora, etc. Drought enduring, that is non-succulent perennials. That means they have a very high property of tolerance. That is, they can tolerate the drought condition. Continuous dearth of water in the soil, that is being tolerated by these plants. That means they have a high power of tolerance. Now, whenever there is a dry situation, these plants get wilted. But still, somehow they continue to survive. Though they are facing a lot of challenges, but still they continue to live. No new growth takes place until moisture is available. Of course, the growth is arrested during that time, but again when there is moisture available, then they again grow, and again this cycle goes on and on. So they are called drought enduring, but they are not succulent, they are non-succulent. And lastly, the true xerophytes, that is drought resisting, which have the ability to maintain growth even under critical dry conditions. That means they are the real fighters. That means they have learned how to deal with this stress by developing different adaptive features. So they are also called the true xerophytes. There is yet another category of xerophyte which are called the phytophytes. The derived from the Greek word that is meaning well. That is well, maintaining well. Like there are some woody plants such as mesquite, that is prosopis, which have deep roots in constant contact with a fringe of capillary water above the groundwater table, and it has a root system reaching down 175 feet. Pinus aristata. This is known to live for 6,000 years or longer on rocky mountains of USA. So these are all examples of the phytophytes. So these are the 5 main groups of xerophytes. Now we'll finally discuss before we end our today's session, we will discuss on the adaptive features one by one. So there are mostly 8 adaptive features. Number 1 is dehydration. Now all these points are already discussed. We will just list them again point wise. That is, desert plants can withstand considerable dehydration. They can tolerate protoplasmic desiccation, because if there is water shortage, what will happen? Protoplasm, which is a jelly-like substance with a lot of water. So all those water, what will happen? There is a shortage of water, so obviously there will be dehydration, like we face dehydration whenever we don't have adequate water. It's similar for the plants. So they suffer due to desiccation, and therefore a lot of due to this protoplasmic desiccation, there is a change, and the colloidal chemical state of the protoplasm that is changed. So dehydration is one major feature. Number 2, rapid elongation of the taproot. Why? Because I told you, because they need to develop the root system, because they need water. The root, you know, that goes deeper and deeper into the water surface in search of water. So they go deeper and deeper into the soil surface, and they search water, and then they absorb water for the plant. So normally these plants, they have very long taproot system. And also the root hairs. These are profusely developed, profusely branched root hairs. Number 3, absorptive capacity. The production, why this production of extensive root system? Because they need to increase their absorptive power, or they need to increase the absorption. It also reduces the exposure of the plant to the atmosphere. If the roots develop more than the shoot, then of course the plants have to face less the environmental dryness, because the roots, they are present below the soil surface. Sometimes adventitious roots do develop, which are also deep and capable of absorbing even minute amount of water. 4th point is high osmotic pressure of the cells. That means high solute content of the cell. The cell possesses a high water potential, 100 to 150 atmosphere. Rigid and inelastic cell wall structure. It prevents cellular collapse under water stress condition. And it also influences the water holding capacity of the soil. And all these actually help the plant to resist water loss through transpiration. Ability to reduce transpiration rate. I told you, leaves are modified to spines. There are dead hairs and sunken stomata. Stomata are closed during the daytime. Epidermis is multi-layered, heavily cutinized. In hydrophytes, there was no cutin, no cuticularization. But here there is cuticularization, cutinization, thick cuticle develops. And even in the epidermal surface, these are present because they need to check the water loss. Stomata is covered by dense hairs. These are also another feature to check the water loss. Stomatal surface is protected by a dense coating of hairs. Sunken stomata. This is very, very important point in xerophytes. The stomata is sunken. You have to remember this. It is embedded within some pits. there are certain pit-like structure develop within which the stomata is embedded. It's not present on the surface. The aim is to check the transpiration. Leaflets of many desert legumes fold upwards. The light green color also is thought to reflect light rays, so that less amount of incoming solar radiation impinges on the leaf surface. And so there is a lesser heating effect due to excessive solar rays or solar radiation. Reduction in size of the leaf blades. Why? Again the same point, because they need to reduce the transpiration. So leaf blades, pinnules of compound leaves are smaller in size. The surface area of the leaf is reduced. Mostly they are the microphylous leaves. Presence of microphylous leaves reduce the amount of transpiration, and that is why they have greater number of leaves, because the surface of the leaf is reduced, so the number is increased, so that they can carry out photosynthesis efficiently. Water diffusion through the mesophyll is very slow. The cells located near the veins can obtain sufficient water supply during water crisis. Desert plants lack green leaves altogether. In plants such as ephedra, reduction in size of leaf blade is such that only the vestigial part is visible. In certain species, leaf blades are entirely lost. Photosynthetic function is taken by the expanded petioles like in phyllodes, or it can be stems like in phylloclad. Change in size and shape of the cells. Cells are smaller with small vacuoles. Desiccated small cells decrease their volume to nearly half, and there is a reduction in size. Cells of hibernating on storage organs like spores, zygotes and seeds generally lack vacuoles. So they have very small vacuoles and smaller sized cells. Sometimes they might have some perinating structures, dormant structures, which actually helps them to tide over adverse conditions. Vegetative organs of ferns and certain angiosperms can remain in a dry state. So they remain in a hibernating condition, and then when again there is a water supply, they revive and they germinate. The last point, that is the metabolism. Now, one very important feature in these xerophytes is that there is an accelerated conversion of polysaccharides into their anhydrous forms. Example, cellulose. So the polysaccharides are mostly converted into this kind of anhydrous kind of sugars. Desiccation may also promote development of suberized cork cells. This is also one kind of protection. Suberin, like lignin, suberin is also another structure which helps in protection. Thickness of the bark, it is very much thick. Conducting vessels, very much well developed. And therefore, the translocation is very powerfully maintained, because these conducting strands or vascular strands are very much well developed. As with cutin, lignification occurs. Annual growth is very much prominent. Even secondary growth is very much prominent. Lignified bast fibers and sclerenchyma are also developed. Just remember that these were not present in hydrophytes. Palisade cells are partly lignified. And lastly, these type of plants have a very unique kind of metabolism called crassulacean acid metabolism. Some of the xerophytes. That is, the stomata, they remain open during night. They absorb carbon dioxide, which is called dark fixation. And this is stored in the cells in the form of certain dicarboxylic acid like malic acid, because daytime they keep their stomata closed to prevent water loss. But during night time, the stomata remain open and they perform the CO2 fixation. And this is known as, such type of plants are called CAM plants or crassulacean acid metabolism plants. Finally, the last point, that is, leaves are hardened plants. They are usually rich in starch, and all tissues are high in inorganic high energy bond phosphate content like ADP and ATP. So learners and friends, today we discussed on the different features of adaptive features of hydrophytes and xerophytes. Please go through the entire unit. It's not very difficult, it's not very complicated, because you will find such plants all around. Go through them, and if you face any difficulty or any queries, you can contact us, write to us, email us, and we will try our best to clarify your doubts and respond to your queries. Thank you all, and we'll meet again in our following sessions. Thank you.